Join me as we kick off the 2023 travel year with a trip to Alberta, Canada. While there, we'll experience the natural beauty of the Canadian Rockies, spending the weekend in Banff. We'll also venture out on some hiking trails, see frozen waterfalls, and even walk around on Lake Louise. Then we'll finish up the weekend in the city of Calgary, exploring the sights that this Western Canadian city has to offer. So put those seat backs in their upright and locked position as we head out to visit our northern neighbor. Greetings from Alberta, Canada. We start off the trip way too early in the morning, as the original flight I booked with Air Canada kept getting delayed, pushing my first day's anticipated arrival past sundown. So when they offered to switch me to a 7 a.m. flight on their partner United free of charge, I took it. Unfortunately, as we'll soon find out, that didn't work out as planned. I attempted to check in online, but the app would not allow me to. I thought it might have something to do with the ground stop that had halted air travel across the country, but as I arrived at LAX, I discovered that was not the issue at all. After speaking with the United rep, I discovered that even though I had been assigned a confirmation number, Air Canada never sent my actual ticket to them. By the time I was able to speak to an Air Canada agent, it was too late for me to make the United flight, so I was rebooked on my original routing. I will say the Air Canada agent was exceedingly nice and ended up putting me in a premium economy seat for my troubles. So despite all of the mix-up, ultimately I ended up exactly where I was supposed to be, but in a better seat. The flight itself was nice enough. The menu had some items that looked decent, however they didn't have most of the better looking selections, and by that point I had mentally talked myself into ordering something, so I went with the chicken pesto wrap. All in all, not exactly the best meal that I've ever had on a plane. I landed in a rainy Vancouver, where the layover wasn't too bad. Though I will say, after getting used to having access to lounges, it was a bit of a change to have to go back to just waiting in the terminal. But oh well, they wouldn't allow me to purchase a day pass to the Maple Leaf Lounge like some other carriers do. I boarded my next flight, and by that point in the day, I was already quite tired. So I took a quick nap, and by the time I woke up, we'd cleared the storms as we flew over the Rockies, where there were some stunning views out of the window for our sundown approach into Calgary. As I exited the terminal, I made my way to the rental car center, where they convinced me to upgrade to a better car than what I had booked, since I was going up into the mountains and this one had better tires. Then, after a quick stop at Tim's, which you know I had to do, I took the hour-and-a-half drive up the mountain to Banff National Park. Unfortunately, because of the arrival time, what I was hoping would be a very scenic drive was obscured by the darkness. Though I will say the booth where you pay your $10.50 per day entry fee to the park looked quite idyllic. From there, it was only a short drive to the town of Banff, where upon arriving I checked into my hotel, Brewster's Mountain Lodge. The property wasn't huge, but it had a kind of kitschy, well, frankly, mountain lodge type vibe. The room was at the end of the second floor hallway, and the room itself was actually kind of big, boasting 2 comfortable beds, a large leather love seat, table and dresser, and quite a spacious bathroom. It even had a deck, though given the temperature, I didn't spend much time out there. After putting away my things, I walked around the streets for a little to get a feel for the place. There didn't seem to be too much happening that night, and I was pretty tired as it was, so I headed back to the room for an early night's rest. The next morning I got up at a decent hour and made my way down to the breakfast nook to grab a quick something to eat since it was included. The selection was fine. It was coffee and bagels and cereal and things like that. When I was done, it was time for me to finally get the trip properly underway, and so I headed out on the road towards the highway. Now in the daylight, you could truly take in the grandeur of the mountainous landscape on the route to Lake Louise. After parking, I took the short stroll towards the lake, which was flanked by the Fairmont Chateau on its northeastern edge to the right of the walking path. This has been a place that I had seen many pictures of in the summertime, where the crystal blue water set upon the backdrop of the mountains was a location that always called to me. But I have to say that experiencing it in the heart of winter may have been even more enchanting. There was just something about the way the snow-capped mountains so seamlessly transitioned into the evergreens, coated with powder, that just made it feel like this was the way that this was meant to be experienced. Not only that, but unlike in the summertime where it was something to be gazed upon, with it frozen over in the winter, it was something that could be walked upon. And though I didn't pack my skates, there were many who were taking advantage of the opportunity by playing hockey or just skating around. Others lived out their holiday dreams by taking a sleigh ride, which appeared from an onlooker's perspective as if it were pulled straight out of a beer commercial. And I mean that in the best possible way. Speaking of drinks, anyone who wanted to take in the view while sipping on a warm cocktail had the opportunity to do so at the ice bar. Some of the items looked good, though for $18 I wasn't too unhappy that I wasn't going to drink since I had to drive. I then made my way from the outdoors towards the hotel. Most of the indoors of the hotel were reserved for guests, however, there were areas in which you could walk around in. Anyone frequenting the lounge was treated to the same beautiful views as outside, but in a climate-controlled area. It was then time for me to head back, but not before taking in the frozen landscape one last time. At least at Lake Louise, there was plenty more along the ride home and throughout the weekend. When I got back to Banff, I felt the need to take my picture by the town sign like any good tourist would do, the parking for which was also used for their recreation center, which, when I saw they had their own curling entrance, I had to check it out. Unfortunately, there was no curling going on that night, but I did check out a few minutes of a youth hockey game as well as a few people skating just outside of the complex. I then walked around a much more active town during nightfall that evening, and anyone who knows me knows that one of my travel staples is to try out the local McDonald's cuisine. This one was pretty good. I enjoyed the poutine, the BLT egg McMuffin was fine, and what's not to like about a mini donut? The next morning I got up relatively early to start the day, where I walked about town, taking some pictures, and just kind of soaking up the mountain atmosphere. I chose to forego breakfast that morning in favor of a non-McDonald's poutine restaurant that I saw that looked pretty good. And though I enjoyed the Mickey D's one, the smoked meat poutine there was fantastic. After lunch, I decided to take some pictures with some locals before heading out to my next destination, with that next destination being Johnston Canyon. And though I may not be much of a hiker, the trail seems straightforward enough, and when in Banff, do as a tourist in Banff would do. I'm certainly glad that I did, because the landscape is something that I'm grateful that I got to take in with my own eyes. At the end of one of the trails, there's a cave that you pass through, the other side of which is an up-close and personal view of the lower falls. Unfortunately, the path to the upper falls was closed when I was there, but that did not in any way detract from the experience of the lower one. After returning to town from a day in the outdoors hiking around, it was time for me to have a proper non-fast food meal. For that, I decided to have some fondue over at the Grizzly House. According to their website, the place started out as a disco, and in order to comply with the local liquor laws, they had to offer food in order to serve alcohol. Originally, they would have Chinese food from their neighboring business delivered from a hole in the wall, but after that establishment closed, they had to think of a new way to comply with the law. The staff brought in their own fondue pots, and that's how the restaurant ended up becoming what it is today. The menu had some more exotic offerings like a rattlesnake and alligator, but I opted for a more traditional beef and cheese fondue. Also, since I wasn't driving anymore that night, I had a maple cocktail, which was pretty good. The next morning brought to a close the mountainous portion of the trip, but not before a stop at Bow Falls. Being there, it was almost as if you were inside an AI rendering of a Bob Ross painting. It was a perfect capper to a great weekend. Though the weekend wasn't actually over, as there was still a day left to explore the city of Calgary, with the ride down providing the daylight views I missed on the way up. Once I got to the city, my first stop was the Saddledome. As an avid hockey fan, I was disappointed that the Flames weren't in town, but on the bright side, it gives me the opportunity to make a future hockey trip that can also include Edmonton and perhaps Winnipeg. Since I couldn't go inside, I drove up a hill to a nearby neighborhood park that overlooked the city and provided a much better overview. The next stop was the Calgary Tower. Built in 1967 to celebrate Canada's centennial, it went on to become a founding member of the World Federation of Great Towers, many of which I visited, but seeing the long list in the lobby, I'm reminded that there's still a lot of world left for me to explore. The elevator ride whisks you up to the observation deck, where there are some great views of the city, and had it been a clearer day, to the Rockies in the distance. What there was a clear view of was straight down through the glass floor extension, which is not for the faint of heart. There were also placards that give you a history of the tower, which, as I've come to discover, are pretty common in these types of venues. I was a little disappointed that the gift shop didn't have a small model of the tower, as I like to collect them, but oh well, there were still a lot of touristy souvenirs available. I then made my way to the Peace Bridge. Opened in 2012, it's a pedestrian and cycling pathway spanning the Bow River that was designed by famous architect Santiago Calatrava, who also designed the World Trade Center transportation hub in New York City, amongst many other famous projects. With most of the touristy sites now out of the way, and it being past 3, I could finally check into my hotel room. The room was standard, perfectly comfortable for a single night's stay. I did hear that this Ramada had concerts in the summertime on the pool deck, but it was the winter and the deck was closed. After I put away my things, I met up with a friend who lives in Calgary for dinner. We ate at a place called Central Taps and Food. It had a real stylish interior with vintage TVs, soda machines, and knickknacks that made it a quite pleasant atmosphere to dine in. The food was good too. After dinner and drinks, a real heavy fog set in throughout, which created a somewhat eerie but quite serene air about the city to explore. I woke up the next morning and by then the fog had lifted. I still had a few hours before I had to head to the airport, so I walked around downtown for a little while. One of the conveniences of Calgary was that despite the cold temperature outside, I was able to walk about in the climate-controlled plus 15 Skywalk. Originally constructed in 1969, it now has over 16 kilometers of elevated, weather-protected walkways in the heart of the city. I also took in some of the city at street level, checking out the downtown core area, which when I was there wasn't very bustling. It was at last time for me to make my way to the airport, but not before a stop at one of my favorite fast food restaurants. Founded in 1959, Harvey's is the fourth largest burger chain in Canada. I first discovered them on a trip to Montreal, and their burgers have an almost sausage-like snap that I just love. After returning the car, I made my way to the terminal to discover that my flight was delayed from the previous night's fog. I was just glad it wasn't that canceled flight that was on the board. The delay wasn't too bad, and the first flight was pretty empty. I even got the row to myself, something that I haven't had in a while. After de-icing the wings, we took off into the nighttime sky, which provided a nice overhead view of the city lights. Another brief layover in Vancouver Airport, and it was finally time to bring this trip to a conclusion. After waiting for the shuttle at LAX, my least favorite part of any trip, I made it back to my car, took the short drive home, and went to sleep. All in all, it was a great trip. It was perfect for a long weekend, and I'm glad you were able to join me on this adventure. I look forward to seeing you on the next one, and until then, let's take one last look back at the long weekend in Alberta, Canada. you.